Move it, old man. You're holding up the line. The voice was sharp, impatient, loud enough for everyone to hear. The retired cop didn't react at first. Frank Miller, 68, stood at the DMV counter with his paperwork neatly stacked, hands steady despite the ache in his knuckles. He wore a faded windbreaker, scuffed shoes, and a veteran's cap pulled low over thinning gray hair. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another tired senior citizen slowing things down. That's exactly how they saw him. "I said move," the clerk snapped again, tapping her acrylic nails against the counter. "You civilians always come in unprepared." A few people in line snickered. Frank blinked once. "Ma'am," he said calmly, voice low but clear, "I've been waiting 42 minutes. My number was called." The clerk rolled her eyes dramatically. "And now I'm calling it again because you filled out the wrong form. Go sit down, start over." Frank glanced at the form. It wasn't wrong. He knew that for a fact. Behind him, a younger man leaned forward, crowding his space. "Jesus, Grandpa, just step aside. Some of us have jobs." Another laugh rippled through the room. Frank slowly turned his head, meeting the man's eyes. "I worked for 41 years, he said evenly. "I'm not in a hurry, but I'm not invisible either." The man scoffed. "Sure you did." The clerk smirked. "Sir, if you're going to argue, I can have security escort you out." That word, escort, landed wrong. Very wrong. Frank's jaw tightened, just barely. He had been threatened before. By armed suspects, by angry crowds, by men who thought age meant weakness. But this wasn't the street. This was supposed to be a place built on order. He leaned slightly closer to the counter. "I'm asking you to check the form again." The clerk slapped her palm on the desk. "That's it. You don't get to tell me how to do my job. You're not a cop anymore." The room went quiet. Frank froze. Not because he was scared, because she was wrong. And because of how she said it. "You're not a cop anymore," she repeated, louder this time. "You're just a civilian now, same rules as everyone else." A security guard began walking over. Young, broad, bored expression. "Problem here?" the guard asked. "Yes," the clerk said quickly. "This man is refusing to comply." Frank looked at the guard, then at the clerk, then at the people watching him like he was a nuisance instead of a human being. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The guard stiffened. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Frank stopped mid-motion. "I'm gonna show you something, because you just forgot a rule." The guard hesitated. "What rule?" Frank pulled out a worn leather wallet. Not flashy, not new. Inside was a badge. Old, scratched, real. He placed it gently on the counter. The room went silent. "This rule," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying farther than he intended, "doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off." The clerk stared at the badge. The guard swallowed. And for the first time since walking into the building, Frank Miller wasn't being treated like an inconvenience. He was being remembered. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The badge lay on the counter like a ghost from another time, dull brass, edges worn smooth by decades of use. Not flashy, not ceremonial. The kind of badge that had been carried through rain, blood, and nights that never quite ended. The clerk's smile faltered. "Well," she said finally, forcing a laugh that rang hollow, "that doesn't mean anything now." Frank didn't move. The security guard shifted his weight, clearly unsure what he was supposed to do next. His hand hovered near his radio, but he didn't touch it. "Ma'am," Frank said calmly, "I didn't put that badge down to intimidate you." "Could have fooled me," the clerk snapped, crossing her arms. "We see fake badges all the time." That stung. Frank inhaled slowly through his nose. "I retired 12 years ago, honorably, sergeant, homicide." A murmur rippled through the line. Someone whispered, Homicide? The clerk waved her hand dismissively. Doesn't matter. You're not special. Rules are rules. Frank nodded once. You're right. Rules are rules. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then follow them. The security guard cleared his throat. Maybe we should just— I've got this, the clerk cut in sharply. She turned back to Frank. Sir, I'm asking you one last time to step aside. You're disrupting operations. Disrupting? Frank glanced around the room. A young mother bouncing a crying baby, a veteran with a cane leaning heavily against the wall, an elderly woman clutching paperwork with trembling hands. This place disrupted people every day. He folded his badge back into his wallet and slid it into his jacket, careful, deliberate. I'm not stepping aside. The clerk's face hardened. Then I'm calling a supervisor. Please do. That surprised her. She picked up the phone anyway, fingers stabbing the buttons. Yeah, I need a floor supervisor at window 3, non-compliant customer. Non-compliant. Frank almost smiled. Behind him, the younger man from earlier scoffed again. See? Should have just sat down, Grandpa. Frank turned slightly, meeting his gaze. You ever been handcuffed? What? The man blinked. Because that's what non-compliance usually leads to. The man shut up. The security guard shifted closer to Frank. Sir, I don't want this to escalate. Neither do I, but it's already there. The supervisor arrived moments later, a woman in her 40s with a clipboard and an expression carved from exhaustion. What's the issue? The clerk spoke fast. He's refusing to comply, arguing about forms, flashing a badge like it gives him privileges. The supervisor looked at Frank. Sir? Frank held up the form. It's correct. Your employee made a mistake. The supervisor scanned it quickly. Her brow furrowed. She flipped it over, checked the code, checked the stamp, then looked back at the clerk. This form is valid. The clerk's face flushed. But why was he told to step aside? He was rude. I said ma'am twice. The supervisor exhaled slowly. Ma'am, she said to the clerk, process his paperwork. The clerk's lips pressed into a thin line. She slid the papers back reluctantly, but she didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the badge. She didn't meet Frank's eyes. Instead, she leaned in and hissed under her breath, Don't think this makes you important. Frank looked at her then, really looked. Importance has nothing to do with it. Respect does. She slammed the stamp down harder than necessary. As Frank signed the final line, he noticed something else. The room had changed. People were watching him differently now, not with impatience, with curiosity, and something else. Recognition. The older veteran with the cane gave him a nod. The young mother mouthed, "Thank you." The security guard stepped back, suddenly unsure of his authority. The clerk shoved the receipt across the counter. "Next!" Frank took the paper, but didn't move. "Is there a problem?" the supervisor asked, cautiously. "Yes, there is." The room went still again. He turned slightly, addressing not just the staff, but everyone. "You forgot a rule today, a rule that kept this country from tearing itself apart." The supervisor stiffened. "Sir, this isn't the place." "It is exactly the place," Frank interrupted, "because rules don't live on streets alone. They live in how we treat people when they have no leverage." Silence. Frank pointed gently toward the clerk. "You saw an old man and assumed he didn't matter." The clerk opened her mouth. He raised a finger. "No, you don't get to speak now." A few gasps. The supervisor looked alarmed. "Sir, I spent 41 years enforcing rules so people like her," he nodded toward the crying baby's mother, "could stand in line without fear, so veterans could walk without being shoved aside, so civilians didn't have to earn dignity." The clerk's face burned red. "And today," Frank continued, voice calm but iron hard, "you treated respect like a privilege instead of a right." No one moved. No one breathed. The supervisor swallowed. "What are you asking for?" Frank shook his head. "Nothing." Then he turned toward the exit. But before he reached the door, the supervisor called out, "Sir?" Frank stopped. She hesitated. "What was the rule?" He turned back slowly. "The rule you forgot is that authority doesn't come from a counter, a uniform, or a badge." He tapped his chest once. "It comes from how you carry responsibility when no one is watching." Then he walked out. Behind him, the clerk stood frozen. The guards stared at the floor, and every person in that room felt something uncomfortable settle in their chest, because they all knew he was right. Frank didn't get far before the doors slid shut behind him. The sunlight outside hit his face like a sudden confession, warm, honest, unforgiving. He paused on the concrete steps, breathing in slowly, letting the noise of the building fade behind him. He hadn't planned to say any of that. He'd walked in that morning expecting paperwork, lines, maybe a little impatience, not disrespect, not being dismissed like furniture that had outlived its usefulness. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the familiar weight in the inner pocket. Not the badge this time, but the folded letter beneath it. Old paper, yellowed edges, a memory he never went anywhere without. Inside the building, things were unraveling. The supervisor stood motionless for several seconds after Frank left. The silence he'd created lingered like smoke after a fire, thick, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. The clerk finally scoffed. "He had no right to talk to me like that." The supervisor turned slowly. "Actually," she said evenly, "he did." The clerk blinked. "Excuse me?" "You escalated a non-issue. You embarrassed a citizen, and you made assumptions." "So what?" the clerk snapped. "He's just some retired cop." That word, just, landed wrong. The supervisor glanced around at the people still waiting, at the veteran with the cane, at the young mother, at the older woman clutching her papers. Then she lowered her voice. "You know what happens when complaints come in." The clerk shrugged. "They never do." But the supervisor was already looking at the security guard. "Did you log the incident?" The guard hesitated. I started to." "Finish it, word for word." The clerk's confidence wavered. Outside, Frank had reached his car, an old, well-kept sedan with faded paint and a dent near the rear bumper. He unlocked it slowly, then stopped. Someone behind him cleared their throat. Frank turned. It was the veteran with the cane. "Mind if I say something?" the man asked. Frank nodded. "Go ahead." The veteran smiled faintly. "You reminded them today." "Of what?" "That we're still here." Frank felt something tighten behind his ribs. The man continued. "They forget, not out of cruelty sometimes, just convenience." Frank sighed. "That's how it always starts." The veteran extended his hand. "Name's Harold, Vietnam." Frank shook it firmly. "Frank, homicide." Harold chuckled. "Figures." They stood there a moment longer, two men shaped by systems that moved on without them. "Take care," Harold said. "You too." As Frank drove away, he didn't notice the security camera angled just right above the entrance, or the fact that the supervisor had already requested the footage. By noon, the incident report had landed on the desk of the regional director. By 1 o'clock, someone recognized the name, Frank Russo. By 2 o'clock, an internal email circulated quietly among senior staff. Is this the same Frank Russo? At 3, a woman in a downtown office pulled an old file from a locked cabinet. Inside it were commendations, letters from grieving families, and one report stamped in red ink. Procedural oversight. Ignored. She frowned. That evening, Frank sat alone in his small kitchen, reheating soup he'd made 2 days earlier. The radio murmured softly in the background. Talk shows arguing about things that never touched real life. He sat down, spoon hovering mid-air, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He answered. "Frank Russo?" "Mr. Russo," a woman said, voice formal but cautious. "I'm calling from the Department of Public Services." Frank closed his eyes briefly. "Yes?" "We received a report today regarding an incident at one of our offices." "I figured." There was a pause. I wanted to hear it directly from you. Frank exhaled slowly. You heard it already. I stood in line, I was treated like a problem, I corrected an error, and I was talked down to. Another pause. Then, were you attempting to use your badge for preferential treatment? No. Did you raise your voice? No. Did you threaten anyone? Frank let out a dry laugh. I haven't threatened anyone in 20 years. Silence. Mr. Russo, she said carefully, are you aware of Rule 14B? Frank's grip tightened on the phone. Yes, he said quietly. I wrote half of it. The line went still. Then you know why this matters. I do. I'm going to need you to come in tomorrow. For what? For a review. Frank stared at the steam rising from his untouched soup. Whose review? He asked. She hesitated. Not yours. The next morning, the building felt different. Staff whispered. The clerk avoided eye contact with everyone. The supervisor sat rigid, hands folded, as two people in suits reviewed footage on a tablet. One of them paused the video. Back it up. They watched Frank stand calmly. They heard the word non-compliant. They saw the badge, briefly. They heard his voice. Measured, controlled, unyielding. This man didn't lose control, one of the reviewers said. No, he exposed one, the other replied. The clerk was called into the office shortly after. She entered with forced confidence. 20 minutes later, she left pale and shaking. By lunchtime, a notice appeared on the internal board. Mandatory respect and conduct refresher, all staff. By afternoon, Ellen Carter stood in Frank's living room, looking around at the modest furniture, the framed photos on the wall. You don't live like a man who wants power, she observed. Coffee takes too much energy, Frank poured. She smiled faintly, then grew serious. You embarrassed a department yesterday. Frank met her gaze. No, I reminded it. She nodded slowly. That rule you mentioned, most people don't know it exists. They weren't meant to, Frank replied. It's for moments when the system forgets its purpose. And yesterday was one of those moments? Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded letter. He handed it to her. She read it silently. Her eyes softened. This is from a mother, Frank said, whose son didn't come home because someone decided procedure mattered more than humanity. Ellen folded the letter carefully. We forgot, she admitted. Frank nodded. That's why rules exist, to catch us when we fall. She stood, tucking the letter back into his hand. We're not done with this. Frank watched her leave. He sat back down, finally eating his soup. Outside, the world kept moving, but somewhere deep inside the system, something had shifted, and it wasn't finished yet.
Frank knew the quiet wouldn't last. It never did. The next morning, his phone rang before sunrise, the kind of ring that carried weight, not urgency. He didn't answer it right away. He stood by the kitchen window, watching dawn bleed slowly into the sky, remembering how many mornings like this he'd started with a badge on his chest and a gun on his hip. Back when calls like this meant someone was already having the worst day of their life. The phone rang again. Frank Russo, he said. Mr. Russo, this is Deputy Commissioner Alan Pierce. Frank's jaw tightened slightly. He hadn't heard that name in years. Didn't expect to hear from you, replied Frank evenly. I imagine not, Pierce said, but after yesterday your name started moving through channels it hasn't touched in a long time. Frank leaned against the counter. That tends to happen when people forget their own rules. A pause. Calculated. You embarrassed my department, Pierce said. Frank smiled faintly. Then you should ask why one man in a waiting room could do that. Pierce exhaled sharply. You knew exactly what you were doing. No, Frank said calmly. I knew exactly what they were doing. Another pause, longer this time. We're convening a formal inquiry, Pierce said. You'll be asked to provide a statement. Frank glanced at the framed photo on the wall, him in uniform, decades younger, standing beside his late wife on graduation day.
I already did, Frank replied, in public. This will be different. It always is. Pierce lowered his voice. Frank, you're retired. You've earned your peace. Why poke the bear now? Frank closed his eyes for a brief moment. Because the bear keeps stepping on people who can't push back. The line went silent. Finally, Pierce said, "Be careful." The call ended. By noon, news of the incident had spread beyond the building. A short clip, grainy, shaky, appeared on social media. Someone had recorded part of the exchange on their phone. Not the whole thing, just enough. The badge, the line, the clerk's tone. The caption read, "Retired cop reminds them who the rules are for." Within hours, comments poured in. Some praised him, some accused him of entitlement, some argued about respect, age, authority. Frank didn't read any of it. He was too busy remembering the look in the clerk's eyes. Not anger, not fear. Uncertainty. That was new for her. Across town, inside a glass-walled conference room, Deputy Commissioner Pierce sat with 3 senior officials and a legal advisor. The footage played again on the large screen. "Pause it there," one of them said. The image froze on Frank's face, calm, steady, unyielding. He didn't raise his voice, the legal advisor noted. "No," Pierce agreed, "which makes it worse." Another official frowned. Worse? Because he didn't lose control, he had it. They all understood what that meant. "Public perception?" someone asked. The advisor sighed. "Split, but leaning sympathetic." "Of course it is," Pierce muttered. "Older man, veteran, retired cop." "He's not wrong," one of them said quietly. Pierce shot him a look. "I didn't say he was, I said he's dangerous." "Because?" "Because he knows the rules better than we do, and he doesn't need anything from us." Silence settled over the room. That afternoon, Frank received another call, this time from someone he hadn't heard from in nearly 15 years. "Frankie," the voice said. Frank chuckled. "Didn't think you were still breathing, Lou." Lou laughed. "Barely. You make the news again?" "Apparently. You always had a talent for stirring things up without spilling coffee." Frank grew serious. "What do you want, Lou?" "I want to know if you're ready." "For what?" "For the part where they try to make this go away." Frank stared out the window. "They already started." Lou lowered his voice. "They're digging. Old cases, old complaints, anything with your name on it." Frank nodded slowly. "Figured. You good?" "I am," Frank said. "Are they?" Lou exhaled. "They should be worried." That evening, a letter arrived by courier. Official. Stamped. Heavy. Frank opened it slowly. Notice of review. Professional conduct. He read it once, then again. They weren't accusing him of doing wrong. Not yet. They were testing the ground. Frank folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the old one from the grieving mother. 2 truths, 1 system. The next day, Frank walked into the inquiry room without a lawyer. That alone made people uncomfortable. The panel sat behind a long table, neutral faces, polite smiles. "Mr. Russo," the chairwoman began, "thank you for coming." Frank nodded. "Didn't want you thinking I had something to hide." A few glances were exchanged. "We're here to understand your actions," she continued. Frank leaned back in his chair, then asked better questions. She cleared her throat. "Do you believe the clerk acted improperly?" "Yes." "Do you believe your response escalated the situation?" "No." "Why?" Frank met her eyes. "Because escalation requires aggression. I brought accountability." The room went still. Another panelist spoke. "Do you feel the department owes you special consideration because of your service?" Frank shook his head. "No." "Then why show the badge?" Frank reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the table. "I didn't show it for privilege," he said. "I showed it for context." The badge caught the light. "This," Frank continued, "doesn't mean I'm better than anyone else. It means I was trusted once to protect the rules you're all sitting behind." The chairwoman swallowed. "And if those rules are forgotten?" she asked. Frank leaned forward. "Then someone has to remember them." No one spoke for a long time. When the meeting ended, Frank walked out alone, but the hallway felt different now. People watched him, not with disdain, not with authority, with recognition. The system had pushed back, and Frank hadn't moved an inch.
Frank woke up to the sound of rain tapping against his window. Soft at first, then steady, like fingers drumming an accusation on glass. He stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm. Rain always did that to him. It slowed time, pulled memories closer. The inquiry room, the badge on the table, the way the chairwoman's voice tightened when he spoke about accountability. He knew what came next. The system didn't like being cornered. By mid-morning, his phone buzzed with messages he hadn't asked for. Former partners, old supervisors, people he hadn't heard from in decades. Some offered support, some offered advice, some offered warnings disguised as concern. Let it go, Frank. You've made your point. Don't turn this into something bigger. Frank didn't reply to any of them. He made coffee, pulled on his jacket, and went for a walk. The neighborhood had changed since he'd moved in. Newer cars, brighter paint, fewer faces he recognized. But the park at the end of the block looked the same. Same benches, same old oak tree where he'd once sat with his wife listening to their daughter rehearse lines for a school play. He sat there now, rain dampening his coat, watching a young couple argue quietly near the swings. Life kept going. Back at the department, the narrative was shifting. Someone had leaked the inquiry notice to the press. Headlines appeared by noon. Retired detective under review after public confrontation. The word "under" did a lot of work. By afternoon, another headline followed. Was Officer Russo always a problem? That one stung, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. Frank read that one. He folded the paper carefully, then slid it into a drawer beneath the old commendations and letters. He'd been here before. That evening, his doorbell rang. Frank didn't rush to answer it. When he did, he found Ellen Carter standing on his porch, rain-speckled, jaw tight. "May I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. She walked into the living room, eyes catching on the framed photos again. The quiet life of a man the system was trying to paint as disruptive. "They're coming after you," she said. Frank poured her coffee. "I know. They're pulling old cases, looking for anything that can muddy the water." Frank handed her the mug. "They won't find corruption." "No," Ellen agreed, "but they might find discomfort." Frank met her gaze. "Truth is often uncomfortable." She sighed. "That doesn't stop institutions from resenting it." There was a knock on the door behind her. Frank opened it to find Lou Alvarez leaning heavily on a cane, rain dripping from his hat. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Lou said. Ellen blinked. "Lou Alvarez?" "In the flesh," he replied. "Or what's left of it." Frank smirked. "You move fast for a man with bad knees." "I move when it matters," Lou said. They sat together, three people who understood systems not as theories, but as living, breathing things that defended themselves viciously when threatened. "They're testing how far you'll go," Lou said. Frank shrugged. "I'm not going anywhere." "That's what worries them," Ellen added. Lou leaned forward. "They don't want a hero. They want compliance." Frank stared at the rain-streaked window. "I gave them compliance for 30 years. All it earned me was silence." The next morning, the clerk from the office called in sick. The day after that, she didn't come in at all. An internal memo quietly announced her transfer to another department. No explanation, no apology, just removal. Publicly, the department released a statement praising professionalism and reminding staff of respect policies. Privately, they began pressuring Frank to settle. A phone call came from a city attorney offering mediation, another from a former superior suggesting he clarify his intent publicly. One even hinted at restoring certain benefits if he de-escalated. Frank declined them all.
Then came the letter. Handwritten, no return address. You think you're untouchable. You never were. Stop now. Frank stared at the note for a long time. He folded it carefully and placed it beside the others. That night, he couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from memory. Faces, names, cases that never left him. People who trusted the system and were failed by it. People who never got a chance to stand up in a waiting room and say no. The next day, Frank received an invitation. A town hall meeting. Open forum. Public. The topic? Respect, authority, and accountability in public institutions. Frank smiled when he read it. They want a stage, he murmured. Lou laughed. Or a trap. Same thing, Frank replied. At the meeting, the room was packed. Cameras, reporters, citizens. Frank sat in the front row, hands folded, expression unreadable. When his name was called, the room went quiet. He stood slowly. He didn't speak first. He looked at the people, at the young, the old, the tired, the hopeful. I'm not here to attack anyone, he said finally. I'm here to remind us why rules exist. Someone scoffed. Frank didn't look at them. Rules aren't shields for authority. They're lifelines for the powerless. Murmurs rippled through the room. I wore a badge once, not to be feared, to be trusted. Silence. And trust, Frank finished, is earned every day, or it dies. The applause started slow, then it grew. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, something shifted again. The system had tried to make it personal, but Frank had made it universal, and that was far more dangerous. The morning after the town hall, Frank Miller's name was everywhere. Not just on local news, not just on the radio, everywhere. Clips of his speech looped endlessly, some trimmed with respect, others sliced into something sharper, more dangerous. One headline called him a voice of integrity, another labeled him a relic who can't let go. Frank watched none of it. He learned long ago that watching yourself get distorted was a special kind of punishment. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, reading the mail. Most of it was junk, until he reached the envelopes written in unfamiliar hands. The first letter was from a woman in Ohio. She wrote about being dismissed at a courthouse because she looked confused. The second came from a veteran in Arizona who had been laughed at by a clerk while renewing his ID. Another from a retired teacher who said, "You said what I couldn't." Frank folded each letter carefully. Then came the voicemails. Not kind, not subtle. You're embarrassing the department. You're making cops look bad. You should have stayed retired. One message ended with laughter. Frank deleted none of them. By noon, a city spokesperson announced an internal review, not of the incident at the public office, but of Frank himself. The language was careful. Past conduct, professional history, contextual patterns. They weren't accusing him of anything. They were implying everything. Ellen called him immediately. They're fishing, and they're loud about it. Frank sipped his coffee. They always get loud when they're nervous. They want to discredit you, she continued. Turn this into a personality issue instead of a policy failure. Frank stared at the steam rising from his mug. Then they've already lost. That afternoon, someone spray-painted his mailbox, the word rat in red. Frank didn't react. He took a picture, cleaned it off, went inside. But the neighborhood noticed. A few neighbors stopped waving. One crossed the street. Others knocked on his door with casseroles and quiet words of support. America had always been like that, Frank thought. Divided not by noise, but by courage. 2 days later, the department released a partial report. It praised professionalism, acknowledged miscommunication, recommended additional sensitivity training. No accountability, no apology, just fog. Frank read the statement once. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and drove downtown.
Inside the administrative building, the air was cold and sterile. Security recognized him immediately. "You can't just walk in," one guard said. Frank met his eyes. "I'm not just anyone." The guard hesitated, then stepped aside. In a conference room upstairs, senior officials sat stiffly, folders arranged like shields. They hadn't expected him. "I'm not here to argue," Frank said calmly. "I'm here to clarify." A man at the far end folded his hands. "This process takes time." "Respect shouldn't," Frank replied. Another official leaned forward. "You're retired. With all due respect, you no longer represent this department." Frank nodded. "That's exactly the problem." Silence. "You think this is about me," Frank continued. "It's not. It's about the next person in line who doesn't have a badge in their pocket." No one answered. Outside the building, reporters waited. Frank didn't stop. That night, a former recruit showed up at his door, young, nervous. "I wasn't supposed to come," the man admitted. Frank gestured him inside. "I saw what happened at the office, and I saw how they handled it." He swallowed. "This isn't what they taught us." Frank studied him. "Then remember that." The recruit nodded. "Some of us still do." When he left, Frank felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. But backlash doesn't fade quietly. It sharpens. A week later, Frank's pension paperwork was flagged for review. Nothing frozen, nothing official, just enough pressure to remind him that stability was conditional. Lou called that night, furious. "They're pushing buttons now." Frank chuckled softly. "Means they're running out of ideas." "You could walk away," Lou said. "You've made your point." Frank thought of the letters, of the woman in Ohio, the veteran in Arizona. "No," he said. "Now it matters." The next morning, a national outlet picked up the story. This time they showed the full video. No edits, no spin, just the clerk, the guard, the moment Frank stood his ground. The response was immediate. Veterans groups spoke out. Senior advocacy organizations demanded answers. Former officers publicly supported him. And quietly, very quietly, someone inside the department leaked something else. A training memo. An old one Frank recognized instantly. The rule, the one they'd forgotten. And suddenly, the conversation shifted from who Frank was to what they'd ignored. The backlash hadn't broken him. It had widened the crack, and the system could feel it.
Frank recognized the memo the moment he saw it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring. Black text, white paper, department seal at the top. No inspiring language, no speeches, just procedure. The kind of document most people skimmed once and forgot. But Frank never forgot paperwork. Paperwork was where the truth hid. The memo dated back 23 years, issued after a public complaint involving an elderly veteran at a licensing office. Frank remembered the incident vaguely, not the faces, but the lesson that followed. The rule was simple. All former sworn officers, regardless of retirement status, retain the right to identify themselves when confronted with potential misconduct or procedural violation. This identification does not grant authority, it grants protection. Protection, not privilege. Frank leaned back in his chair, holding the printed copy Lou had dropped off that morning. "We trained us on this," Lou said, pacing the room. "Then they buried it when it became inconvenient." Frank nodded. "Rules only last as long as someone remembers why they exist." The memo leaked overnight. By morning, it was everywhere. Legal analysts debated it. Former chiefs weighed in. Comment sections exploded. Some called it outdated. Others called it necessary. But no one could deny it existed. Ellen called before noon. "They can't dismiss this. It's policy, still technically active." Frank smiled faintly. Then they broke it. The department issued a hurried statement claiming the rule was open to interpretation. That phrasing didn't land well. A retired judge went on air that afternoon and dismantled the argument sentence by sentence. You don't interpret protection, you honor it. By evening, a city council member requested a formal hearing, public, televised. Frank received the notice in his email. Subject line, witness request, Frank Miller. He didn't hesitate. The night before the hearing, Frank couldn't sleep, not from nerves, but from reflection. He sat at his kitchen table, the old badge resting beside the memo. He thought about the first day he'd pinned it on, how heavy it felt, how careful he'd been. He thought about the last day he'd worn it, folding the uniform slowly, knowing he was leaving something behind, but not everything. The hearing room was packed. Cameras, officials, citizens. The clerk from the office sat 2 rows behind her supervisor, eyes down. Frank noticed. When his name was called, he walked to the microphone slowly. No rush, no performance. He placed the memo on the table in front of him. I'm not here to defend my pride. I'm here to defend a principle. He explained the rule, where it came from, why it existed, who it was meant to protect. This isn't about cops getting special treatment. It's about preventing abuse when authority forgets itself. One council member leaned forward. Are you saying this rule was violated? Frank met her eyes. Yes. Intentionally? Frank paused. Negligently, he said, which is often worse. Murmurs filled the room. He continued. When I identified myself, I wasn't asking for respect. I was reminding them of accountability. The clerk shifted uncomfortably. Frank didn't look at her. This rule was designed to protect citizens because one day every officer becomes one. Silence. After the hearing, reporters swarmed him. Frank answered only one question. Do you feel vindicated? Frank shook his head. I feel responsible, because if I don't speak up now, the rule dies with me. That quote ran everywhere. By the next morning, the department announced a full review of public-facing conduct protocols, mandatory retraining, policy reaffirmation, public apology forthcoming. The clerk resigned quietly. Not forced, not fired. Resigned. Frank heard about it secondhand. He felt no triumph, only relief. A week later, a small ceremony was held at the department. No fanfare, no speeches, just a revised policy binder distributed to staff. Inside, the memo was restored, highlighted, referenced. Frank wasn't invited. He didn't need to be. Instead, he sat on a bench in the park, watching children chase pigeons. A man approached, hesitantly. Older, veteran's cap. Mr. Miller? He asked. Frank nodded. The man swallowed. I was at the DMV last year, got treated like dirt. He held out his hand. Thank you. Frank shook it. That's why the rule exists, Frank said quietly. As the man walked away, Frank felt the weight lift. Not completely, but enough. The rule had been remembered, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. The apology came on a Thursday morning. Not shouted, not dramatic, not even televised. Just a carefully worded statement posted on the department's official website at 8:07 a.m. We acknowledge that procedural errors were made. We regret the treatment of Mr. Frank Miller. We reaffirm our commitment to respecting all citizens. Frank read it twice. Then he closed the laptop. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. The kind of tired that comes after a long watch finally ends. Ellen called an hour later. They admitted fault, she said. That almost never happens. Frank looked out his window at the quiet street. A mail truck rolled by. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower hummed. They didn't apologize because of me, Frank said. They apologized because they were caught. That still matters, Ellen replied. Frank nodded. It does, but what matters more is what comes after. What came after surprised everyone. Within 2 weeks, the city council passed a resolution formally reinstating the forgotten rule, not buried in a memo this time, but written plainly into the public conduct code. Training manuals were updated, supervisors were instructed to enforce it, violations would now be reviewed by an independent civilian board. For the first time in decades, the rule had teeth. Frank learned this not from the news, but from Lou, who stopped by with coffee and a folded printout. "They're calling it the Miller Clause," Lou said, half smiling. Frank frowned. "I didn't ask for that." "No," Lou said, "but you earned it." Frank shook his head slowly. "The rule was already there. All I did was remind them." Lou leaned back. "That's how most important things work." Words spread. Letters began arriving, handwritten, careful, some shaky. Retired officers, widows, veterans, people who had felt small in places where authority loomed large. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in her 70s. She wrote about being dismissed at a government office years ago after mentioning her late husband's service. "I didn't want special treatment," she wrote. "I just wanted to be heard." Frank folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer beside his badge. The badge still sat there, untouched, a symbol, not a weapon. Weeks passed. The story faded from headlines, replaced by louder scandals and faster outrage. Frank preferred it that way. One afternoon, he found himself back at the same office where it had all begun, not by accident, by choice. He needed to renew a vehicle registration. He took a number. He sat. He waited. The clerk at the counter was new, young, professional, polite. When Frank stepped forward, she smiled. "How can I help you today, sir?" No edge, no impatience, just courtesy. Frank completed the transaction in silence. At the end, she slid the receipt across the counter. "Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your service." Frank paused. Not because she knew who he was, but because she didn't. He nodded once. "Thank you for doing your job well." As he walked out, he noticed a small plaque near the entrance. "All citizens deserve dignity. Authority exists to serve, not diminish." Frank stopped, read it again, then left. That evening, Frank attended a retirement dinner for a former colleague. No speeches about him, no mention of the incident, just laughter, stories, coffee served too late. At one point, a younger officer approached him. "I heard about what you did," the man said quietly. Frank raised an eyebrow. "I stood my ground." The officer nodded. "That's harder than it sounds." Frank studied him. "You'll learn," he said. "Authority isn't about how loud you are. It's about how careful." The officer smiled. "I'll remember that." As the night wound down, Frank stepped outside into the cool air. The city lights glowed softly. Not hostile, not warm, just there. Frank realized something then. This wasn't his victory. It was the rule's survival. Rules mattered, not because they controlled people, but because they restrained power. Frank went home. He opened the drawer one last time. He took out the badge, ran his thumb across the worn edges. Then he placed it back, closed the drawer. Somewhere in the city, a clerk hesitated before raising their voice. A supervisor chose patience over authority. A citizen spoke without fear. And a rule, once forgotten, lived on. Not because a retired cop demanded respect, but because he remembered what respect was for.